Well, if you go back to the pre-constitutional period and you ask how were these entities actually structured, they were all the products of statutes, or in very early days the products of some charter that was given to the proprietors, the people that the king sent over to take over these colonial possessions. So you never find an instance, other than way on the frontiers where the statutes didn't reach. I mean, you really had people essentially out on their own. But within normal jurisdictions in the colonial period, every militia was the product of some statute, and all very detailed as to what went on. And everyone was a member of the militia from 15 or 16 years old to usually 50, 55, 60 years old. The lower limit being a question of maturity, the older limit being a question of senility, really. People, by the time they became 50, 55 years old, had all sorts of medical problems in those days, and so they really couldn't serve in many capacities. And so they exempted them, in essence, by age, said, well, we don't need you anymore, you're too old. That, of course, didn't prevent people in that age bracket from serving if they could. And in fact, you find many of the officers in the militia were people in their 50s or 60s, right? But it was simply a recognition on the part of the legislature that we can't compel someone 55 years old to perform this service. They may not be physically able to do so. But it was a statutory entity. And it would be a statutory entity today if it were done properly. You have to understand the National Guard and most of these state guard type organizations are not in fact proper constitutional militia structures. They're some adjunct of the regular armed forces. And this actually came about at the turn of the 20th century. The militia structure in this country was essentially the same from the first congressional statute in 1792 up through 1900, let's say. And then 1903, an act was passed called the Dick Act, after Representative Dick, as Ohio congressman, which was the beginning of the development of what we now call the National Guard. And that act, relevant to what we're talking about here, did two things. First, it used this term National Guard in reference to the militia. And that's the first time you find a congressional statute referring to this National Guard concept. And then secondly, it purported to break up the militia into two categories: the organized militia, which it called the National Guard, and then a thing which at that time it called the reserve militia. Well, this was a fundamental break from the constitutional pattern, because under the constitutional pattern there is no such thing as a reserve militia. There may be different categories of service within the militia, but there is no such thing as a reserve militia, people who just don't participate. So that was the first break, and then that later became the concept of the unorganized militia. The present statute talks about the militia of the United States being composed of the organized militia, which is the National Guard, and then this thing called the unorganized militia, which is everybody else who does nothing. Now, that's another fascinating situation. Let me just go back one step here. The present statute talks about a thing called the militia of the United States. Is there such a thing constitutionally? Of course not. Find it in the Constitution. Militia is the militia of the several states. These are state institutions. They're not a national institution. And there are as many of them as there are states. So we have 50 of them now, right? There is no such thing as the militia of the United States. So the Congress couldn't even get it right in terms of the nomenclature. But the National Guard evolved from the 1903 Act. There's an act in 1908, and there's one in 1914, and the National Defense Act of 1916, 1933, 1940. It becomes separate from the concept of militia, which is the total organization of society, into this more or less elite group, which is based upon voluntary membership. I mean, I'm not a member of the National Guard, never have been. I should have been, throughout my youth at least, a member of the militia. That's the difference. National Guard is actually an adjunct of the regular armed forces. Now, if you think about that, you realize that, well, as an adjunct of the National Armed Forces, it can't be a militia. Look at the Constitution. The armed forces power of Congress is in 2, 3 separate clauses from the power with relationship to the militia. These are separate entities. You look at the President's authority as Commander-in-Chief. He's Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, and he's Commander-in-Chief of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. He has two capacities because these are two separate entities. And the ultimate reason for that is, and without casting any aspersions on the armed forces, is that the Founding Fathers were rather suspicious of standing armies. They didn't trust standing armies, and for good reason. They'd had some bad experiences with the standing army of their own country, that is the British Empire, right? So they made it very clear in the Constitution that these entities, the potential standing army and the militia, were going to be separate and distinct. They had different sources, they had different authority. As an example, President is the only official of the general government who is an officer of both the armed forces and the militia. All the officers of the militia other than the President are appointed by whom? By the states. Whereas the officers of the regular army are appointed ultimately by the Senate of the United States, right? That confirm. The President appoints them and the Senate confirms them. So that even two separate mechanisms for appointing the people who are going to be in command of these entities. One is through the states and one is through the President and the Senate. So the Founding Fathers wanted a separation here. And if you look at the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment does not say an armed force being necessary to the security of a free state. It says a well-regulated militia, right? Recognizing that distinction that so-called standing armies historically had always represented a danger to a free state. Standing armies were the things that lined up with usurpers and tyrants, or maybe the standing army itself simply took over, right? The generals took over. This was the history. Certainly even in Britain they had had that kind of experience. Certainly had been the history of many, many European countries with which the Founding Fathers, and of course the Roman Empire, the various Greek city-states, they could go back in ancient history with this. So that distinction was made very, very clear. And the problem that we now have is we do not have that distinction in reality. We do not have in any state in this union a well-regulated militia according to the correct constitutional pattern.